August 23, 1305. London Bridge. Thousands of severed heads stare from their pikes, rotting monuments to medieval justice. But today, they witness something far worse than their own deaths. Below them, a man is being dragged through the streets, naked, bound to wooden boards, his skin scraping against cobblestones with every yard. This is William Wallace, Scotland's greatest warrior, the commoner who defeated English armies 3 times his size. King Edward I has promised to make an example that will echo through eternity. What happens next isn't the Hollywood version. This is the documented reality of the most savage execution ever devised by medieval law. And by the end, you'll understand why even hardened soldiers vomited at the sight. The road to Smithfield. 8 years earlier, William Wallace was nobody special. A minor landowner's son with no great destiny, until the English came. What they did transformed a peaceful man into the most feared guerrilla fighter in British history. He united Scottish clans. He won impossible victories. He made Edward Longshanks rage with frustration. But by 1305, Scotland had been ground into submission. Most nobles bent the knee. Wallace refused. Edward deployed spies across Scotland like a spider's web. He offered £30 for Wallace's head, enough to buy an estate. The betrayal came from Sir John Menteith, a Scottish knight who'd pledged loyalty to Edward. On August 5, 1305, near Robroyston outside Glasgow, Wallace walked into an ambush. He was taken alive. The journey south was its own torture. Paraded through English towns in an iron cage, children throwing stones, women spitting. But the worst part wasn't the humiliation. It was knowing what awaited him in London. If you appreciate history told without filters, consider leaving a like. It helps more people discover these untold stories. The trial, London in August, was a furnace of sewage and rotting fish. On August 22nd, when Wallace arrived, the entire city emptied to see the famous rebel. They housed him overnight, guards hearing him pray until morning. The next day, the procession to Westminster Hall was political theater. Wallace mounted on a horse, surrounded by the mayor, sheriffs, and knights. This wasn't transportation. This was a victory parade. Westminster Hall was packed with spectators who'd paid for viewing spots. Then came the cruelest joke. As Wallace was led to the platform, they crowned him with a laurel wreath, mocking his alleged boast that he deserved to wear a crown in Westminster. The judges sat in scarlet robes, 5 commissioners appointed by Edward. These weren't impartial arbiters. They were Edward's men. Sir Peter Mallory rose to read the charges: treason, sedition, homicide, robbery, arson. But here's the fascinating part. Under English law, Wallace couldn't actually be guilty of treason. Treason required breaking an oath of allegiance. Wallace had never sworn loyalty to Edward. The English lawyers knew this, which is why they added the lie that Wallace sought to make himself King of Scotland. When Mallory asked Wallace to respond, the Scottish knight spoke his only words at trial: "I cannot be a traitor, for I owe him no allegiance. He is not my sovereign. He never received my homage. And whilst life is in this persecuted body, he never shall receive it." Standing there crowned in mockery, surrounded by enemies, knowing horrific death was certain, Wallace still refused to acknowledge Edward's authority. Scotland was not England's to rule, and he was not Edward's to judge. The court's response was swift. Since Wallace had been declared an outlaw, he had no right to speak. The sentence, drawn through the streets, hanged by the neck, disemboweled with his entrails burned before his eyes, then beheaded and quartered. the pieces sent across the realm as warning. This wasn't a death sentence. This was a blueprint for the complete annihilation of a human being. The drawing guards stripped Wallace naked and bound him to a hurdle, a wooden frame designed to be dragged behind horses. Face down, arms stretched wide, legs spread and tied. The route from Westminster to Smithfield covered nearly 4 miles through London's busiest districts. Edward wanted every person to see Wallace reduced to bloody meat. The procession moved at walking pace, slow enough for crowds to gather, fast enough to ensure continuous abrasion against cobblestones. The first few yards merely abraded the skin, but as the journey continued, constant friction wore through flesh, exposing raw muscle to filthy London streets. Contemporary accounts describe the blood trail growing wider and darker. The crowd pressed close. Some threw rotten vegetables, stones, excrement. But here's what romantic retellings miss. Wallace didn't lose consciousness. The Lanercost Chronicle notes he seemed to be reciting psalms throughout. Every bump, every sharp stone, every impact registered in a nervous system pushed beyond endurance. By the time they reached Smithfield, witnesses described seeing bone through the worst abrasions. His face showed broken teeth, a shattered nose, one eye swollen shut. Yet he still lived, still suffered, still knew worse was coming. The execution, Smithfield, was London's traditional execution ground. On this day, it hosted a carnival atmosphere. Vendors sold meat pies and ale. Wooden galleries had been erected for wealthy observers. Parents lifted children onto their shoulders. Leave a comment with your thoughts on how history remembers moments like these. Was Wallace's suffering remembered the way Edward intended? The executioner was likely John Malsoin, London's official headsman. This work required specific skills, keeping the victim alive through multiple stages of agony. His assistants had prepared their tools with surgical care, knives sharpened to razor keenness, the brazier glowing with coals. Wallace was hauled onto the scaffold, his raw flesh leaving blood smears on wooden planks. The hanging apparatus was deceptively simple, a rough wooden gallows with hemp rope. But this wasn't the merciful snap of a broken neck. Medieval hanging was strangulation. The executioner positioned the noose behind Wallace's left ear, ensuring gradual constriction rather than instant death. 2 assistants hauled on the rope, lifting Wallace until his feet cleared the scaffold by 18 inches. Wallace's face transformed as oxygen deprivation took hold. Red, then darker red, then purple as capillaries burst. His tongue swelled and turned black. Bloody foam formed at his lips. After approximately 3 minutes, long enough for Wallace to experience the full terror of suffocation, short enough to avoid complete unconsciousness, Malsoin gave the signal. Wallace crashed to the scaffold floor. Then came terrible gasping as his crushed windpipe tried to draw air. This was the art of execution. Not to kill quickly, but to bring the victim to death's edge repeatedly. Assistants dragged him to a special table with iron restraints and secured his limbs with metal shackles. The table was tilted so the crowd could see everything. Wallace's head was strapped down, preventing him from looking away. The executioner approached with a specialized knife. He made his first cut just above the groin. The emasculation was performed with clinical efficiency. Medieval executioners understood anatomy well enough to maximize pain while avoiding fatal hemorrhage. The removal wasn't done in a single cut, but in stages. The testicles, severed, held up for inspection, then thrown into the brazier. The smell of burning flesh filled the air. Then the penis itself, removed with deliberate slowness, as Wallace's screams echoed across Smithfield. But that was merely the prelude. The executioner moved to Wallace's abdomen. He made a careful incision from sternum to pelvis. This required exceptional skill. Too deep, and the victim would bleed out quickly. Too shallow, and evisceration would be impossible. As the executioner parted the layers of Wallace's abdomen, the crowd could see his organs pulsing within. Wallace, still conscious, could lift his head slightly and see his own viscera exposed to afternoon sun. The executioner reached into Wallace's body cavity and grasped the intestines, all 20 feet coiled within. With slow, deliberate movements, he began to pull. Yard after yard of glistening tissue emerged, thrown into the brazier. Medieval thought held that the bowels were the seat of courage. The burning of the entrails while the victim watched represented the destruction of the victim's inner self. Wallace's screams had transformed into something barely human, a continuous, high-pitched keening. Some claim he continued to pray. Others say his vocalizations had passed beyond language into pure expressions of agony. What all agree on, he remained conscious, aware, watching. After the intestines came the other organs: stomach, liver, spleen. Each held up for inspection before joining the flames. Medieval witnesses report victims could remain conscious for 10 to 15 minutes after evisceration began. 10 to 15 minutes of watching your own insides become outsides, of smelling your own organs burn. The crowd, initially enthusiastic, grew quieter. Some left, unable to stomach what they'd come to see. At some point, Wallace's body began to fail. His remaining eye rolled back. His screams faded to whispers, then nothing. Whatever made William Wallace himself retreated to some final redoubt of consciousness. Recognizing Wallace was fading, the executioner moved to complete his work. The beheading required a heavy axe. Wallace was repositioned, his mutilated body dragged to the block. The crowd grew silent. The executioner raised the axe high. Sunlight glinted off the blade. The axe fell with a sound like a butcher's cleaver hitting meat. But the first blow didn't completely sever the neck. The blade cut deep, but not through. Wallace's body convulsed, a final surge of nervous activity. The second blow was true, separating head from body with surgical precision. The executioner grasped Wallace's head by the hair and held it high, turning to show all four corners of the crowd. Behold the head of a traitor. Some witnesses swore they saw Wallace's lips still moving. Aftermath. Even death brought no end to the degradation. The executioner and his assistants began the final phase, the quartering. The body was systematically dismembered, arms removed at the shoulders, legs separated at the hip joints, the torso split down the middle. Wallace's head was parboiled in water and herbs, then tarred for preservation and mounted on a pike. Within hours, it took its place on London Bridge. The four quarters were packed in salt and sealed in barrels. One quarter went to Newcastle, another to Berwick, the third to Stirling. Each major Scottish town would display a piece of their former champion, a rotting reminder of English power. But here's where Edward's plan unraveled. He'd intended Wallace's execution to be so horrific it would end Scottish resistance forever. Instead, the very brutality transformed him from defeated rebel into martyr. The quarters of his body, meant as warnings, became shrines. Scots visited these gruesome displays, not in fear, but in reverence. Robert the Bruce, who had previously collaborated with the English, was reportedly among those deeply affected by Wallace's execution. Less than a year later, he raised the standard of rebellion again. this time successfully. When asked what drove him to risk the same fate, Bruce allegedly replied he'd rather die like Wallace than live as Edward's slave. The execution meant to end Scottish independence had instead galvanized it. Within days, Scottish minstrels began composing songs about his death. Raw, angry laments that turned English cruelty into Scottish determination. Singing about Wallace became punishable, but this only drove the songs underground, where they grew darker and more powerful. Even English soldiers who'd witnessed the execution spread a counter-narrative. They'd expected to watch a demon die. Instead, they'd seen a man endure unthinkable tortures, yet refuse to break. King Edward III died in 1307, just 2 years after Wallace's execution. He died still fighting Scottish rebels, his conquest incomplete. The Scottish resistance that Wallace had started and his death had energized would triumph at Bannockburn in 1314. The final irony is that Wallace's execution achieved immortality for a man who might otherwise have been forgotten. Had Wallace died in battle or been quietly executed, he would likely be a minor figure, overshadowed by Robert the Bruce. But the spectacular nature of his death, the very extremity meant to diminish him, instead elevated him to mythic status. Edward the Falcon, in trying to destroy Wallace utterly, created a legend that would outlive the English medieval monarchy itself. 7 centuries later, William Wallace's death remains terrifyingly relevant. His executioners thought they were destroying a rebel. Instead, they created an immortal reminder that the human spirit, even when broken, can triumph over tyranny. The echo of Wallace's defiant words still resonates. "I cannot be a traitor, for I owe him no allegiance. Legitimate authority requires consent. Sovereignty cannot be imposed by force alone. And some principles are worth any suffering to defend." If you found this deep dive valuable, please leave a like and share this video. Subscribe for more documentary-style investigations into the darkest chapters of human history. History isn't always heroic, but it's always worth remembering.